Okay, welcome to the first lecture video. We're going to be doing some really important stuff today. We will discuss the sort of basic tools that you're going to need to do philosophy. We're going to be using these tools throughout the semester. I would advise you to watch this video twice, maybe take notes. We will do a bit of review on Monday, but not as much as what's in this video. So we will be sort of diving in and beginning to use the tools a bit right away. So here are some of the questions we're going to discuss this semester. Does God exist? What is rational belief, or under what conditions is it rational for you to believe something? What is the good life? What are our moral obligations, if any? Are we free? And is there meaning in life? Here are, for each of these questions, these sort of deep questions about things that you care about, I'm sure, and things that are at least arguably sort of reflective of sort of deep aspects of human nature. And that's probably part of the reason why we all care about them so much. For each of these questions, there are going to be a sort of menu of options of how one might answer them. This is simplifying a little bit, and as we go through the semester, you'll see that there's more than two answers for each, but this roughly captures the sorts of views we'll be discussing. So under the topic, does God exist? We've got theism and atheism. That's going to be our first topic, and those are the sort of two views you could take. Of course, there's a third view, which we will discuss, which is agnosticism, which is sort of neither theism nor atheism. What is rational belief? Evidentialism and pragmatism. What is the good life? Egoism or virtue theory? What are our moral obligations? Relativism or objectivism? And then under freedom, we've got incompatibilism and compatibilism, and meaning there's nihilism versus optimism. You don't need to know what all these words mean yet. We're obviously going to take a lot of time under each of these topics to discuss their meaning as we go. The point, though, is that there are a lot of options in philosophy for these questions that are already themselves really hard. The questions are hard and they don't have an obvious answer, and there's many answers. So you might think, okay, well, if it's a question, I'm going to want to figure out what I think the answer is, right? How do I do that? Like, what method do I use to figure out the answers to these important questions? This is made more difficult by the obvious fact that there are no philosophy microscopes, right? In science, you can run experiments, and in conjunction with mathematical analyses of your data, nothing's certain in life, but over time, the scientific community can come to some conclusions about say general relativity, or the physics of the very small, or the rejection of vitalism in biology, or the periodic table, right? These things are relatively well established in the sciences by empirical observation. Philosophy, you can peer through microscopes all day long, and it's not going to give you the answer to the question of whether there is freedom, for example. As we'll discuss, sometimes empirical data is relevant, right? So when we get to the freedom topic, one relevant premise in an argument against freedom is that determinism is true, that everything in the world is sort of mechanically, scientifically determined by goings-on that come before it. You might think that science is part of what helps establishes the truth of determinism, but as we'll see, the claim that determinism rules out freedom is itself a philosophical claim. You're not going to be able to see the truth of the incompatibility of freedom and determinism under a microscope. So microscopes aren't going to do the trick for us. Neither are there any philosophy scriptures, right? If you're religious and you want to know the answer to some question about, I don't know, how a particular sacramental exercise ought to go during a ceremony of some sort. You could consult your religious scripture, and that'll give you the answer. We do have old texts from old philosophers that we sort of respect and think of as wise, but as philosophers, we don't consider as wise as those who came before us were. We don't think of them as like religiously infallible or divinely inspired. In fact, we will often be challenging the arguments of these philosophers, and I'm going to encourage you to do the same thing. And this is something that doesn't happen often in religious contexts. So no scriptures, no microscopes. There's also not there's not a consensus among professional philosophers, right? So you might be like, well, if after 1,000 years of study, every philosopher agreed that there's no free will, maybe that would tell us something. But as we'll see, for each of these topics, there's just like deep disagreement between philosophers about what the right answer is, and there has been for centuries. That disagreement is not going away. So there's no consensus, scripture, or microscopes. How do we determine the answers? Well, this is the method that we'll be using in philosophy class, what we'll call the method of argument. So, for example, here's the free will question. Are we free? What we'll do when we hit that topic toward the end of the semester is the first thing we'll want to know is, well, what are the arguments for the claim that we're free? What are the arguments against the claim that we're free? We'll try our best to understand the arguments on both sides. They can't both be true, the conclusions of those arguments, because one says we're free and the other says we're not free. Contradictions aren't true. So one or the other of these sets of arguments has to be flawed. But the first thing we need to do before we can start figuring out which ones are flawed is just like understand them. We'll gather together the arguments, understand them, and then we'll start asking which side has the best argument. We're going to start to evaluate the arguments. Are the arguments for free will any good? Are the arguments against free will any good? And then we're going to weigh the strengths and weaknesses of the arguments. It can be very complicated. It's rare to get the sense that, all the arguments for atheism are just obviously bad. If you're thinking that way, you probably need to slow down and try your best to be more charitable to the author you're reading and more charitable to the argument, because these arguments that we'll be discussing are not being pushed by people who haven't thought through what they're saying. This is coming from a really thoughtful place, and one thing I want to encourage all of us to do is to be really respectful of the texts and the philosophers we're reading. And I think that that's going to, even if you disagree with the conclusion, I think that that's going to help us to be respectful with one another and be able to have good, fruitful disagreement. Disagreement is really good, I think, as long as it's done in the right way.